A luxury pickup truck speeds down a dirt road. The vehicle stops next to a muddy swamp among frogs and dense undergrowth. From the passenger seat, a young woman in a white dress is thrown out. Without a word, the rich man wipes his hands with a handkerchief and drives away. A German shepherd hidden in the bushes watches without moving. The young woman lies there, half sunk in the mud, as the sound of the engine fades away. The dog approaches slowly and begins to nudge her with its snout, but when she takes a deep breath, the world seems to stop for an instant. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now, we return to our story. The oppressive Louisiana heat hung thick in the air as the expensive black SUV cut through the muddy back roads of St. Martinville Parish. Its tires carved deep grooves in the wet earth, a stark contrast to the peaceful evening sounds of the bayou where crickets chirped and bullfrogs croaked their ancient songs. Spanish moss draped from ancient oak trees like ghostly curtains, swaying gently in the humid breeze that carried the scent of magnolia and marsh water. The vehicle came to an abrupt halt beside a forgotten wetland, a place where only cattle egrets and the occasional alligator ventured. The passenger door swung open with a metallic creak, and without a backward glance, a well-dressed man in an expensive tailored suit emerged. His movements were calculated, almost mechanical, as he reached back into the vehicle and carefully lifted out the unconscious form of a young woman in a flowing white dress. Sophia Bennett, 22 years old and heir to one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in southern Louisiana, lay motionless in his arms. Her auburn hair cascaded over his sleeve like silk, and her pale skin seemed almost luminous in the fading daylight. The delicate fabric of her dress, once pristine and elegant, now seemed tragically out of place against the wild backdrop of the marshland. Jonathan Westfield, a man whose name carried weight in both New Orleans business circles and Washington political corridors, showed no emotion as he placed Sophia's unconscious body on a patch of dry ground, partially concealed by tall marsh grass. The contrast between her refined appearance and the raw wilderness couldn't have been more striking. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, straightened his silk tie, and without a word returned to his vehicle. The engine roared to life, drowning out the natural symphony of the bayou for a moment before disappearing into the distance. Silence returned to the wetlands, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the rustle of leaves in the warm evening air. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the landscape. What Jonathan hadn't noticed, however, was the pair of intelligent brown eyes watching from the dense undergrowth. A German shepherd, his thick coat matted with mud and his muzzle dirty from foraging, had been observing the entire scene with the focus of a trained investigator. The dog remained perfectly still until the sound of the engine faded completely into the distance. Only then did he emerge from his hiding place, moving with careful deliberation toward the unconscious young woman. His name was Duke, and though he now lived wild in the marshlands, he had once been part of something much more significant. Memories of commands, training exercises, and the satisfaction of completed missions flickered through his canine consciousness like half-remembered dreams. Duke approached Sophia with the caution of an experienced tracker. His nose twitched as he caught her scent, mixed with something chemical and foreign that made his hackles rise slightly. She was breathing, though shallowly, and her pulse was steady, but weak. The dog circled her once, then settled down beside her still form, his body providing warmth and protection against the cooling evening air. As darkness began to claim the bayou, a light rain started to fall, creating tiny ripples on the water's surface and adding to the humidity that already saturated the air. Duke's instincts, honed by years of specialized training he could barely remember, kicked into high gear. With gentle nudges of his muzzle, he began to move Sophia away from the wetter areas of the marsh, carefully guiding her unconscious form to higher, drier ground beneath the shelter of a massive cypress tree. The effort was exhausting, but Duke persevered with the determination that had once made him valuable to his human handlers. Step by careful step, he managed to relocate Sophia to a small clearing where the ground was firm and relatively comfortable. Wild jasmine grew in abundance here, its sweet fragrance helping to mask any human scent that might attract unwanted attention. Hours passed before Sophia began to stir. Her first sensation was confusion, followed quickly by a throbbing headache that seemed to pulse behind her eyes. The world around her was unfamiliar, filled with strange sounds and smells that her city-raised senses couldn't immediately identify. When she tried to sit up, waves of nausea washed over her, and she had to close her eyes and breathe deeply to keep from being sick. It was then that she became aware of the warm presence beside her. Opening her eyes slowly, she found herself looking into the concerned gaze of the German Shepherd. Despite her disorientation and fear, something about the dog's expression was oddly comforting. His tail wagged once, tentatively, as if he was trying to reassure her that she was safe. Sophia tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. Where am I?" The words seemed to echo strangely in the humid air, and she realized she had no memory of how she had come to be in this wild place. The last thing she could remember clearly was having dinner at Commander's Palace in New Orleans, celebrating what Jonathan had called a new beginning. For both of them, Duke seemed to understand her distress. He rose to his feet and disappeared into the undergrowth, returning minutes later with a broad leaf cupped carefully in his mouth. The leaf held a small amount of fresh rainwater, which he offered to her with the gentle intelligence that marked his every action. Sophia accepted the gift gratefully, the cool water helping to clear some of the fog from her mind. As her consciousness continued to return, she began to take stock of her situation. Her white dress was stained with mud and grass, and she could feel scratches on her arms and legs that she didn't remember receiving. On her right wrist, she noticed red marks that looked suspiciously like rope burns, though she had no memory of being restrained. Most puzzling of all, on her left hand was an ornate ring featuring a coat of arms she'd never seen before. The ring was heavy, made of what appeared to be white gold, and set with a deep blue sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds. The coat of arms engraved on its face depicted a sailing ship beneath 3 stars, with Latin text that she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. She had no memory of putting on the ring, and its presence on her finger filled her with an inexplicable sense of unease. Duke watched her examination of the ring with what seemed like recognition in his intelligent eyes. He whined softly, a sound that somehow conveyed both sympathy and urgency. The dog seemed to be trying to communicate something important, but Sophia's confused mind couldn't grasp what he might be attempting to tell her. As the night deepened, around them, bringing with it the full chorus of bayou sounds, Sophia found herself depending more and more on her unlikely guardian. Duke remained alert, his ears constantly moving to track sounds that she couldn't even hear. Every so often, he would rise and walk a small perimeter around their resting place, as if ensuring their safety before returning to her side. Despite her fear and confusion, Sophia felt a strange sense of protection in the dog's presence. There was something almost human about his intelligence, as if he understood not just her immediate physical needs, but also the deeper mystery of her situation. As exhaustion finally began to overcome her anxiety, she found herself grateful for this unexpected companion in what felt like the most vulnerable moment of her life. The bayou settled into its nighttime rhythm around them, with Duke maintaining his vigilant watch over the young woman who had been abandoned to the wilderness. Neither of them could have known that this was only the beginning of a mystery that would challenge everything Sophia thought she knew about her life, her family, and the man she had trusted with her future. Dawn broke slowly over the Louisiana bayou, painting the sky in soft pastels that reflected off the still water like watercolors bleeding into wet paper. Sophia awakened to the sound of Duke's gentle whimpering, his warm breath on her face as he tried to rouse her from a fitful sleep filled with fragmented dreams and shadowy figures she couldn't quite identify. Her body ached in places she didn't. A no could hurt, and when she tried to move, every muscle seemed to protest. The white dress that had once been so beautiful was now thoroughly ruined, stained with mud, grass, and the unmistakable marks of a night spent in the wilderness. But she was alive, and for reasons she couldn't fully understand, she felt safer in this wild place with her canine guardian than she had in months. Duke stood and stretched, his movements fluid despite the obvious signs that he too had spent an uncomfortable night on the hard ground. He looked at Sophia with those intelligent brown eyes, then turned and began walking away from their makeshift camp. After a few steps, he paused and looked back, clearly waiting for her to follow. "You want me to come with you?" Sophia's voice was still hoarse, but it was stronger than it had been the night before. Duke's tail wagged once, in what she interpreted as confirmation, and despite every instinct that told her to stay put and wait for rescue, she found herself trusting this remarkable animal. Rising unsteadily to her feet, Sophia followed Duke deeper into the marsh. The ground was treacherous, with hidden pools of water and patches of sucking mud that threatened to pull her shoes clean off her feet. But Duke seemed to know every safe path, leading her around the dangerous areas with the confidence of someone who had traveled these routes many times before. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes, moving through a landscape that seemed both beautiful and menacing. Ancient cypress trees towered overhead, their gnarled roots creating natural bridges over small waterways. Spanish moss hung like tattered curtains, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator's bellow echoed across the water. Finally, Duke led her to what appeared to be an abandoned structure, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and the encroaching wilderness. It was an old cabin, probably built sometime in the early 1900s, when this area might have been more settled. The walls were weathered grey wood, and the roof had several holes that let in shafts of morning sunlight, but it was dry and offered protection from the elements. Inside, Sophia was surprised to find that someone had been maintaining the space, though not recently. There was a wooden table, still solid despite its age, a few chairs that wobbled but were usable, and in one corner what appeared to be a makeshift bed consisting of old blankets and a pillow that had seen better days. The air smelled of dust and old wood, but it was infinitely preferable to sleeping on the ground. Duke immediately went to a corner of the cabin and began digging at the floorboards with his claws. After a moment, he managed to pull up a loose board, revealing a small cache underneath. From this hiding place, he retrieved a plastic-wrapped package and brought it to Sophia. Inside the waterproof covering, she found basic supplies: bottled water, energy bars, a small first aid kit, and what appeared to be a change of clothes in approximately her size. "How did you know about this?" she asked the dog, though she didn't expect an answer. Duke simply sat and watched her with that same intelligent expression, his head tilted slightly as if he was evaluating her condition and determining what she needed most. Meanwhile, 60 miles away in New Orleans, Margaret Bennett was pacing the elegant hardwood floors of her Garden District mansion like a caged animal. At 55, Margaret was a formidable woman who had built a successful career in real estate law, but all of her professional composure had crumbled in the 3 days since her daughter had disappeared. The police had been polite, but ultimately unhelpful. Detective James Morrison, a tired-looking man in his 40s, with the bearing of someone who had seen too much, had taken her statement and promised to look into Sophia's disappearance. But Margaret could tell from his demeanor that a 22-year-old woman who had last been seen having dinner with a prominent businessman didn't rank high on his list of priorities. Mrs. Bennet, Detective Morrison had said, consulting his notes with the air of a man going through the motions, "Your daughter is an adult, and there's no evidence of foul play. Sometimes young women need space, need to figure things out on their own. I'm sure she'll contact you when she's ready." But Margaret knew her daughter better than anyone, and Sophia would never disappear without explanation, especially not when she had been so excited about her upcoming business venture with Jonathan Westfield. The very thought of Jonathan made Margaret's jaw tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. There was something about the man that had always made her uncomfortable, though she had never been able to put her finger on exactly what it was. Jonathan Westfield was everything a mother might want for her daughter on paper. He was successful, charming, cultured, and had shown genuine interest in Sophia's ideas about sustainable development in Louisiana's coastal regions. He had made substantial investments in environmental restoration projects and had a reputation as a forward-thinking businessman who understood the delicate balance between progress and preservation. But there were things about Jonathan that didn't add up, inconsistencies that Margaret's trained legal mind couldn't ignore. His business dealings were always just slightly too perfect, his timing always just slightly too convenient, and there were the stories, whispered rumors in the tight-knit New Orleans business community about other young women who had become involved with Jonathan and then quietly disappeared from social circles. Not disappeared in the dramatic sense, but rather faded away, relocated to other cities for new opportunities or personal reasons that were never quite explained. Margaret had tried to dismiss these stories as typical gossip, but now, with Sophia missing, they took on a more sinister significance. She had spent the previous day retracing her daughter's steps, visiting every location where Sophia had been seen in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The maitre d' at Commander's Palace remembered seeing Sophia with Jonathan, remembered that she had seemed excited but also nervous, checking her phone frequently throughout dinner. She kept looking at some papers, the man had told Margaret. Legal documents, I think. Mr. Westfield was explaining something to her, pointing to different sections. She seemed, well, a little overwhelmed by it all. Legal documents. Margaret's pulse quickened at the memory of that conversation. What kind of legal documents would Jonathan have been showing to Sophia? And why hadn't Sophia mentioned anything about signing papers when she had called her mother that morning to confirm their lunch plans for the following day? Back in the cabin, Sophia was slowly beginning to piece together fragments of memory from that evening at the restaurant. She remembered Jonathan's smile, warm and reassuring, as he explained what he called a partnership opportunity. She remembered the wine, a particularly good vintage, that had made her feel relaxed and happy. But after that, her memories became increasingly hazy. There had been papers, she was certain of that now. Important papers that Jonathan had said would secure her financial future and allow her to pursue her environmental work without worrying about funding. But try as she might, she couldn't remember what exactly she had signed or why the memory felt so troubling. The ring on her finger seemed to mock her confusion. She had examined it more closely in the daylight and could now make out the Latin inscription around the coat of arms. Veritas vincit omnia. Truth conquers all. It was an ironic message given her current situation, where truth seemed to be the one thing that eluded her completely. Duke had been coming and going from the cabin throughout the day, always returning with something useful. Fresh fruit that he had somehow acquired, clean water, even a worn but serviceable blanket. His behavior was unlike any dog she had ever known, displaying an intelligence and purposefulness that seemed almost human. As evening approached, bringing with it the chorus of night sounds that had become familiar over the past 24 hours, Sophia found herself thinking about her mother. Margaret would be worried sick by now, probably calling hospitals and police stations, demanding answers that no one could provide. The thought of her mother's anguish was almost harder to bear than her own confusion and fear. "I have to find a way home," she said to Duke, who was lying beside her in the gathering darkness. "My mother must be going crazy with worry." Duke lifted his head and looked at her with what seemed like understanding, but also something else. A warning, perhaps, or a recognition that going home might not be as simple as she imagined. As if reading her thoughts, he rose and went to the loose floorboard again, this time retrieving something else from the hiding place. It was a collar, but not an ordinary pet collar. This one was made of heavy leather and equipped with what appeared to be a small recording device. Duke brought it to her and sat down, waiting patiently as she examined the unusual apparatus. When she pressed a small button on the side, a red light began to blink, indicating that it was recording. "What is this?" she whispered. But Duke's only response was to place his head on her lap, his warm weight a comfort in the growing darkness. Whatever secrets this collar held, whatever purpose Duke had served before finding her in the marsh, Sophia sensed that these mysteries were somehow connected to her own inexplicable situation. As the bayou settled into its nighttime rhythm around them, Sophia found herself faced with questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve. But for now, she was safe, she was alive, and she had an unlikely protector who seemed determined to help her find the answers she needed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she would rest and gather her strength for whatever lay ahead. The morning of the fourth day brought with it a clarity that Sophia hadn't experienced since awakening in the marsh. The fog in her mind was beginning to lift, and with it came memories that made her stomach clench with a mixture of anger and fear. She sat by the cabin's broken window, watching Duke patrol the perimeter with the precision of a trained sentinel, and tried to piece together the fragments of that fateful evening. The wine had tasted strange, she remembered now. Not unpleasant, but different somehow, with a slight metallic aftertaste that she had attributed to the vintage. Jonathan had been so attentive, so charming, refilling her glass whenever it was empty and encouraging her to celebrate properly what he called their new partnership. "Partnership," she said aloud, and the word felt bitter on her tongue. Duke's ears perked up at the sound of her voice, and he trotted over to sit beside her, his intelligent eyes focused on her face as if he could read her thoughts. The papers she had signed were becoming clearer in her memory as well. There had been a marriage certificate. She was certain of that now. Jonathan had presented it as a formality, a business arrangement that would allow them to combine their resources for the environmental restoration project they had discussed. "It's purely legal," he had assured her, his smile warm and convincing. "Just a way to streamline the bureaucracy and get the funding we need." But even in her drugged state, something had felt wrong about signing those documents. Her hand had trembled as she wrote her name, and she had asked Jonathan repeatedly if they could wait, if they could review everything with her lawyer first. He had been insistent, though, explaining that the opportunity was time-sensitive and that delays could cost them the federal grants they needed. Now, sitting in the abandoned cabin with only a stray dog for company, Sophia realized just how thoroughly she had been manipulated. The ring on her finger wasn't just a symbol of a fake marriage. It was evidence of a carefully orchestrated deception that she was only beginning to understand. Duke seemed to sense her distress and nuzzled her hand gently. The collar with its mysterious recording device lay on the table beside her, and she found herself staring at it with growing curiosity. Last night, she had been too exhausted and confused to explore its capabilities fully, but now she was ready to discover what secrets it might contain. She picked up the collar and examined it more closely. The recording device was more sophisticated than she had initially realized, with multiple buttons and what appeared to be a small speaker. When she pressed what seemed to be a playback button, the device crackled to life with a sound that made her heart race. "She's not going to remember any of this," came Jonathan's voice, distorted but unmistakably his. "The sedative will ensure that. By the time she wakes up, if she wakes up, she'll be so disoriented that no one will believe whatever story she tries to tell." Sophia's hands shook as she listened to the recording, her worst fears being confirmed by Jonathan's cold, calculated words. But there was more, and she forced herself to keep listening despite the nausea that was building in her stomach. "The property transfer will be complete within a week," continued another voice, one she didn't recognize. "Once she's officially listed as missing, the marriage certificate will allow you to claim inheritance rights to the Bennett land. It's worth at least 20 million, probably more once the offshore wind farm project gets approved." 20 million dollars. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she realized the true scope of Jonathan's deception. Her family's land, the property that had been in the Bennett family for generations, was apparently worth far more than she had ever imagined. And Jonathan had been willing to drug her and abandon her in the wilderness to get his hands on it. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Margaret Bennett was experiencing her own revelations. She had spent the morning at the offices of Westfield Enterprises, Jonathan's business headquarters in the Central Business District. Officially, she was there to discuss Sophia's disappearance with Jonathan himself, but her true purpose was to gather information about the man her daughter had trusted. Jonathan's office was everything she would have expected: tastefully decorated, expensively furnished, and designed to impress. The man himself was as charming and concerned as ever, expressing appropriate worry about Sophia's disappearance and offering to help with the search in any way possible. "I've been in contact with several private investigators," he told Margaret, his handsome face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Sometimes these situations require resources beyond what the police can provide. I hope you'll let me cover the costs." But Margaret's trained eye caught details that others might miss. On Jonathan's desk was a file folder marked Bennett Property Assessment, and when he excused himself to take a phone call, she managed to glimpse documents that made her blood run cold. Property surveys, environmental impact studies, and what appeared to be preliminary plans for a massive development project. Her family's land, the pristine coastal property that her great-grandfather had purchased in the 1920s, was being evaluated for commercial development. But how could that be possible when Sophia was the sole heir and Sophia had never mentioned anything about selling or developing the property? When Jonathan returned to the office, Margaret confronted him directly. "He saw the files on your desk," she said, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "What interest do you have in my family's property?" Jonathan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Sophia and I had discussed various investment opportunities," he said smoothly. "She was very interested in sustainable development projects that could benefit both the environment and the local economy. Sophia would have told me about any plans to develop our land," Margaret replied firmly. "She knows how much that property means to our family." "Perhaps she was planning to surprise you," Jonathan suggested, but his tone had become noticeably cooler. Or perhaps she wanted to present you with a complete proposal rather than involving you in the preliminary discussions. Margaret left, the meeting more convinced than ever that Jonathan was connected to her daughter's disappearance, but she still had no concrete evidence and no idea where to look for Sophia. As she walked back to her car, she noticed a man in work clothes approaching her from across the street. He was older, probably in his 60s, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his life working outdoors. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said hesitantly, "but I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation with Mr. Westfield. Are you Margaret Bennett?" Margaret nodded cautiously, unsure whether this stranger represented another threat or a potential source of information. "My name is Thomas Dufresne," the man continued. "I used to work for Mr. Westfield, maintaining his properties out in the bay parishes. I quit 3 months ago because I couldn't stand to be part of what he was doing anymore." "What exactly was he doing?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Thomas looked around nervously before answering. "There were other young women, Mrs. Bennett. Women who got involved with Mr. Westfield and then just disappeared. Not all at once, you understand, but over time. They'd relocate suddenly, or their families would receive word that they'd married and moved away. But I saw things, heard things, that made me think it wasn't as voluntary as it appeared." Margaret's heart began to race. "Do you have names? Evidence?" "I have some documentation," Thomas admitted. "Letters, property transfers, marriage certificates. I kept copies because something about it all felt wrong. But I never knew what to do with them until I heard about your daughter." Back in the bayou, Sophia continued listening to the recordings on Duke's collar, each revelation more disturbing than the last. She learned that she wasn't the first woman to be targeted by Jonathan's scheme, that there had been others who had supposedly relocated or married and moved away after becoming involved with him. She learned that her family's property was just one of several valuable parcels that Jonathan had acquired through similar deceptions. But most importantly, she learned that Duke wasn't just a stray dog who had happened to find her in the marsh. According to the recordings, Duke had been part of an investigation into Jonathan's activities, a specially trained animal who had been working with law enforcement before the investigation was mysteriously shut down. The dog was getting too close, she heard Jonathan's voice saying on one of the recordings. "Someone trained him well, maybe too well. When we lost him in the marsh, I thought that would be the end of it. But if he's still out there, still recording, he could cause problems." Duke had been placed with her intentionally, Sophia realized. Whoever had been investigating Jonathan had anticipated that he would try to disappear his victims in the bayou, and they had prepared accordingly. Duke wasn't just her protector, he was gathering evidence that could be used to stop Jonathan and expose his scheme. As the implications of this revelation sank in, Sophia felt a mixture of hope and terror. Hope because it meant that someone out there knew what Jonathan was doing and was trying to stop him. Terror because it meant that her situation was even more dangerous than she had realized. Duke seemed to understand that she had discovered his true purpose. He approached her and placed his head on her lap, looking up at her with eyes that held unmistakable intelligence and purpose. This wasn't just a dog who had happened to save her. This was a trained investigator who had been working to bring down a man who had hurt countless women. "We need to get this evidence to the right people," Sophia said to Duke, gesturing to the collar. "We need to make sure Jonathan can't hurt anyone else." Duke's tail wagged once, and then he stood and walked to the cabin door, looking back at her expectantly. It was time to leave their refuge in the marsh and return to the world where justice could be served. But as Sophia prepared to follow her unlikely partner, she couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Margaret sat across from Thomas Dufresne, in a quiet corner of Café du Monde, the bustling sounds of the French Quarter providing perfect cover for their clandestine conversation. The manila folder that Thomas had brought contained documents that made Margaret's hands shake with a combination of rage and vindication. Here, finally, was proof of what she had suspected all along. "This one here," Thomas said, pointing to a marriage certificate dated 6 months earlier, was a young woman named Rebecca Thibodeau. She inherited a sugar plantation near Lafayette worth about $15 million. According to this document, she married Mr. Westfield in a private ceremony, but no one in her family ever met him. They received a letter saying she had moved to California to start a new life. Margaret studied the document carefully. The signature looked rushed, almost shaky, and the witness signatures were from people she didn't recognize. "Did you ever see Rebecca after this supposed marriage?" "Never," Thomas replied grimly. "But I helped transport some of her belongings to a storage facility, and I overheard Mr. Westfield on the phone discussing property transfers. He was very specific about making sure all legal requirements were met for inheritance claims." The pattern was becoming clear. Jonathan targeted young women from wealthy families, particularly those who stood to inherit valuable property. He would romance them, convince them to sign marriage documents under false pretenses, and then arrange for them to disappear. Once they were gone, he could claim their inheritances as their legal husband. "There are 4 other cases in that folder," Thomas continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have spoken up sooner, but Mr. Westfield has connections everywhere. Police, judges, politicians. I was afraid no one would believe me, and I was afraid of what might happen to me if I tried to expose him." Margaret flipped through the documents, finding similar patterns in each case. Marriage certificates, property assessments, and in some cases, what appeared to be transfer documents moving ownership of valuable land to shell companies that Thomas believed were controlled by Jonathan. "What changed your mind?" Margaret asked. "Why are you willing to help now?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee with the hands that showed years of hard work. "Because I have a daughter too," he finally said. "She's about the same age as your Sophia. When I heard about what happened to her, I couldn't live with myself knowing I might have prevented it." While Margaret was gathering evidence in New Orleans, Sophia and Duke were preparing for their dangerous journey out of the marsh. The recordings on Duke's collar had revealed that Jonathan believed her to be lost permanently in the vast Louisiana wetlands. But they had also made it clear that he would stop at nothing to protect his scheme if he discovered she was still alive. Duke had been restless all morning, pacing around the cabin and occasionally stopping to listen intently to sounds that Sophia couldn't hear. His behavior suggested that something was approaching, and she found herself trusting his instincts completely. Whatever training he had received before being assigned to investigate Jonathan, it had clearly included techniques for detecting potential threats. "What is it, boy?" she asked, but Duke's only response was to pick up his collar and bring it to her. The message was clear. It was time to go. Sophia gathered the few supplies she had found in the cabin and prepared to leave the shelter that had protected her for the past several days. As she stepped outside, she could hear the distant sound of boat engines still far away, but definitely approaching. Duke's ears were at full alert, and the hackles on his neck were beginning to rise. They had been discovered. Moving as quickly as she could through the treacherous marsh terrain, Sophia followed Duke along paths that seemed to exist only in the dog's memory. Behind them, the sound of engines grew louder, accompanied now by human voices calling out commands. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. "Over here!" she heard someone shout, and a chill ran down her spine as she recognized the voice. It was Jonathan himself, and he wasn't alone. Duke led her toward an area of the marsh that seemed particularly dense and difficult to navigate. Ancient cypress trees created a canopy so thick that very little sunlight penetrated to the ground level, and the water was deeper here, requiring them to move carefully from one piece of solid ground to another. "Mr. Westfield, are you sure she's out here?" came another voice, this one unfamiliar to Sophia. "We've been searching for hours, and this place is enormous. If she's still alive, she could be anywhere." "She's here," Jonathan replied, his cultured voice carrying easily across the water. "The tracking device I placed in her ring is still transmitting. She can't have gotten far on foot in this terrain." Sophia's blood ran cold as she looked down at the ornate ring on her finger. A tracking device. That's how he had found them. Without hesitation, she pulled the ring from her finger and threw it as far as she could into the deep water of the marsh. The splash it made seemed impossibly loud in the humid air. Duke looked at her approvingly, then continued leading her through the maze of waterways and vegetation. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued, but they seemed to be moving in the wrong direction now, following the false signal from the discarded ring. Meanwhile, back in New Orleans, Margaret was meeting with Detective Morrison, this time armed with Thomas's evidence and a determination that couldn't be ignored. The detective's attitude had changed dramatically when presented with documented proof of multiple suspicious disappearances, all connected to Jonathan Westfield. "This is substantial," Detective Morrison admitted, reviewing the marriage certificates and property documents. "But we're going to need more than paperwork to build a case that will stick. Westfield has expensive lawyers and powerful friends." "What about the other women?" Margaret asked. "If we can find them, get them to testify about what really happened." Detective Morrison shook his head grimly. "We've already started making inquiries based on these documents. Rebecca Thibodeau's family hasn't heard from her in months, despite supposedly receiving letters. The address in California where she was supposed to be living doesn't exist. The other women have similar stories." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. If these women weren't living new lives in distant cities, as their families had been told, then where were they? "We need to find your daughter," Detective Morrison continued. "If she's still alive, she may be the only witness who can testify about Westfield's methods. But Mrs. Bennett, I have to be honest with you. The chances of finding someone who's been missing for days in the Louisiana marsh system—" "She's alive," Margaret interrupted firmly. "I know she is, and I'm going to find her." In the bayou, Sophia and Duke had managed to put some distance between themselves and their pursuers, but they were still far from safety. The marsh seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and Sophia was beginning to realize that getting out on foot might be nearly impossible without Duke's guidance. As they rested on a small island of dry ground, Sophia listened to more of the recordings on Duke's collar. She learned that the investigation into Jonathan had been extensive, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and spanning several years. But the investigation had been shut down abruptly after political pressure was applied, and the evidence had been scattered or suppressed. Duke had been the key to the investigation, a specially trained animal capable of gathering evidence that human investigators couldn't obtain. His handler had been a federal agent named Sarah Mackenzie, who had worked undercover to get close to Jonathan's organization. But according to the recordings, Agent Mackenzie had disappeared 3 months ago, around the same time that the investigation was officially closed. The dog was her backup plan, Sophia heard someone saying on one of the recordings. Mackenzie knew that if something happened to her, Duke would continue the mission. She trained him to recognize the signs of Westfield's operation and to protect potential victims until help could arrive. So Duke wasn't just gathering evidence. He was actively working to save women like herself from Jonathan's scheme. The realization filled Sophia with a mixture of gratitude and determination. Agent Mackenzie might be gone, but her work would not be in vain. As evening approached, bringing with it the familiar sounds of the bayou settling into its nighttime rhythm, Sophia made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to run and hide, she would use the evidence that Duke had gathered to expose Jonathan once and for all. "We're going back," she told Duke, looking into his intelligent eyes. "Not to hide, but to fight. It's time to finish what Agent Mackenzie started." Duke's tail wagged once, and for the first time since awakening in the marsh, Sophia felt truly hopeful. They had evidence, they had each other, and somewhere out there, her mother was looking for her with the determination that only a mother could possess. Jonathan Westfield had underestimated the women he had targeted, thinking them weak and helpless. But he was about to discover that some things were more powerful than money, influence, or carefully laid plans. Truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried, and justice had allies in the most unexpected places. The hunt was about to become a confrontation, and this time the predator would become the prey. The morning sun cast long shadows across the bayou as Sophia and Duke began their carefully planned return to civilization. But this time, they weren't fleeing. In desperation, they were moving with purpose, armed with evidence that could finally bring Jonathan Westfield to justice. Duke had spent the early hours of dawn scouting their route, his training evident in the way he systematically checked for potential dangers and escape routes. Sophia had listened to every recording on Duke's collar during the night, and the full scope of Jonathan's operation was now clear to her. It wasn't just about individual women and their inheritances. It was a sophisticated scheme that had been operating for years, targeting vulnerable heiresses across the Gulf Coast region. The evidence suggested that at least 7 women had disappeared under similar circumstances, their families receiving fabricated stories about new lives and fresh starts. But most disturbing of all was what she had learned about Agent Sarah Mackenzie, Duke's original handler. According to the final recordings, Mackenzie had gotten too close to exposing Jonathan's network. She had been about to present her evidence to a federal grand jury when she vanished, officially reported as having requested a transfer to another assignment. But Duke's collar contained her final message, recorded just before she disappeared. "If you're hearing this," Agent Mackenzie's voice said through the tiny speaker, "then something has happened to me, and Duke has found someone who needs help. The evidence is all here, documented and verified. Jonathan Westfield is not working alone. He has connections in law enforcement, the judicial system, and political circles that reach all the way to Washington. But he made one mistake. He underestimated the determination of the families of his victims." As they moved through the marsh, following paths that Duke seemed to know by instinct, Sophia couldn't help but think about the other women who had found themselves in her situation. Had they felt the same terror, the same confusion? Had any of them survived to tell their stories? Her questions were partially answered when they reached the edge of the marsh, where the wild wetlands gave way to cultivated farmland. Hidden among a grove of live oak trees was another structure, similar to the cabin where they had sheltered but better maintained. And sitting on the front porch, as if waiting for them, was a young woman with dark hair and tired eyes. "Rebecca?" Sophia called out tentatively, remembering the name from the documents Thomas had shown her mother. The woman looked up, and Sophia saw a flicker of recognition in her expression. "You're Sophia Bennett," she said, rising to her feet. "Duke has been bringing me information about you. I was hoping you'd make it out of the marsh." Rebecca Thibodeau was very much alive, but her story was harrowing. Like Sophia, she had been drugged and abandoned in the bayou after signing papers she barely remembered. Unlike Sophia, she had been lost in the wilderness for weeks before Duke found her. and the experience had left her afraid to return to the world. He told my family. I had moved to California, Rebecca explained, as they sat together in the safety of the hidden shelter. But I've been here the whole time, too scared to go back. Jonathan has people everywhere, and I didn't know who to trust. Duke has been taking care of me, bringing me supplies and keeping me hidden. Sophia felt a surge of anger at the calculated cruelty of Jonathan's scheme. He hadn't just stolen from these women, he had stolen their lives, their identities, their very existence. But now, with evidence and witnesses, they finally had a chance to fight back. We can't hide forever, Sophia said firmly. There are other women out there who need our help, and our families deserve to know we're alive. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Margaret was working with Detective Morrison and a growing team of investigators to build a case against Jonathan. The evidence that Thomas had provided had opened doors to a federal investigation, and agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division were now involved. Special Agent Maria Santos, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with extensive experience in complex fraud cases, had taken charge of the investigation. She reviewed the documents with the thoroughness that Margaret had been hoping for from the beginning. This is definitely part of a larger pattern, Agent Santos confirmed. We've had reports of similar schemes in Texas, Mississippi, and Florida. Always the same methodology: target wealthy young women, gain their trust, drug them during what appears to be a romantic dinner, and then use forged documents to claim inheritance rights. But where are the victims? Margaret asked, the question that had been haunting her since Thomas first showed her the evidence. If they're not living new lives in distant cities, what happened to them? Agent Santos exchanged a meaningful look with Detective Morrison before answering. We believe they're being held somewhere, probably in the marsh areas where they can't be easily found. The logistics of the scheme require the victims to remain alive, at least initially, to maintain the illusion that they've voluntarily disappeared. The possibility that Sophia was not only alive, but potentially being held somewhere accessible, filled Margaret with renewed hope. But it also raised urgent questions about how much time they had before Jonathan decided his captives were more of a liability than an asset. Back in the bayou, Sophia and Rebecca were making their own plans to ensure that Jonathan could no longer hurt anyone. Rebecca knew the locations of other hidden shelters in the marsh, places where Duke had indicated other women might be hiding. Together, they could gather the survivors and the evidence needed to expose Jonathan's entire operation. There's something else you need to know, Rebecca said, as they prepared to move to the next location. Jonathan isn't just stealing property, he's also involved in some kind of development scheme that requires specific pieces of land along the coast. Your family's property is crucial to his plans because of its location and its environmental protections. This revelation added another layer to Jonathan's motivation. It wasn't just about individual inheritances. It was about assembling a collection of coastal properties for a massive development project that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. As they traveled deeper into the marsh, following Duke's lead, they found evidence of Jonathan's broader operation. Hidden cameras, communication equipment, and supply caches suggested that this wasn't just a place where victims were abandoned, it was a staging area for ongoing activities. At their third stop, they found another woman, this one barely conscious and clearly in need of medical attention. Her name was Amanda Broussard, and she had been missing for over a month. Unlike Sophia and Rebecca, Amanda had not adapted well to life in the marsh, and her physical and mental condition was deteriorating rapidly. We need to get her help, Sophia said, but Rebecca shook her head. If we take her to a hospital, Jonathan will know we're alive. He has people watching the medical facilities waiting for any of his victims to surface. We need to find all the women first, gather all the evidence, and then surface all at once so he can't cover his tracks. It was a difficult decision, but Sophia understood the logic. If they acted too quickly, Jonathan would simply disappear, taking his resources and connections with him. Other women would disappear, and the cycle would continue. But as they worked to care for Amanda in the hidden shelter, Duke's behavior began to change. The dog was agitated, constantly moving to the windows and doors, his ears alert to sounds they couldn't hear. Something was approaching, and from Duke's reaction, it wasn't friendly. "He's found us," Rebecca whispered, recognizing the signs from her own previous encounters with Jonathan's search parties. "We need to move, now." As they prepared to flee, once again carrying the barely conscious Amanda between them, Sophia felt a surge of determination. She was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being a victim. It was time to turn the tables on Jonathan Westfield, and she had the evidence and allies to do it. But first, they had to survive whatever was coming through the marsh toward them. Duke had positioned himself between the approaching threat and the women he was protecting, his body tense and ready for action. The final confrontation was about to begin, and this time, Jonathan would discover that his victims were no longer helpless prey. The game had changed, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. In the distance, the sound of boat engines grew louder, but Sophia no longer felt fear. She felt ready to fight. The sound of approaching boats grew louder as Sophia, Rebecca, and the weakened Amanda made their way through the treacherous marsh. In terrain, Duke moved ahead of them, his trained senses alert to every sound and movement in the dense Louisiana wetlands. But this time, something was different about his behavior. Instead of leading them away from the approaching sounds, he seemed to be guiding them toward a specific location. "Duke, no," Rebecca whispered urgently. "We need to get away. From them, not closer." But the German shepherd paid no attention to her protests. He had stopped at the edge of a small clearing and was looking back at them with an expression that Sophia had learned to interpret. Duke wasn't afraid of whoever was approaching. He was expecting them. The first boat that emerged from the morning mist carried Jonathan Westfield and two men Sophia didn't recognize. Jonathan's usually pristine appearance was disheveled, and there was a wildness in his eyes that suggested desperation. When he saw the three women standing in the clearing, his face twisted with an emotion that was equal parts relief and fury. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" he called out across the water, his cultured voice carrying an edge of madness. "I've invested too much in this operation to let a few frightened women ruin everything." But before Jonathan could reach the shore, a second group of boats appeared from the opposite direction. These carried Margaret Bennett, Detective Morrison, Agent Santos, and a team of federal agents. Duke's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. He had been leading them to a location where backup would arrive. "Jonathan Westfield," Agent Santos called out, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. "You are under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. Shut off your engine and prepare to be boarded." The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Jonathan's companions immediately surrendered when faced with overwhelming law enforcement presence, but Jonathan himself seemed to snap under the pressure of seeing his carefully constructed scheme collapse. "You don't understand," he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. This wasn't just about money. These women were standing in the way of progress, holding on to property that could benefit thousands of people. The Coastal Development Project would have created jobs, brought investment to the region, helped with hurricane protection infrastructure. By drugging women and stealing their inheritances, Sophia stepped forward, her voice strong despite everything she had endured. By making their families think they were gone forever. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she saw her daughter alive and standing strong in the face of her tormentor. The reunion she had dreamed of was happening in the most unlikely of circumstances, but Sophia was not the broken victim that Margaret had feared she might find. "Sophia," Margaret called out, but Agent Santos held up a hand to keep everyone in position until Jonathan was secure. As the federal agents moved to arrest Jonathan, he made one last desperate attempt to justify his actions. "They were all willing participants at first," he insisted. "They signed the documents voluntarily. If they hadn't tried to back out, none of this would have been necessary." "With documents you forged and minds you compromised with drugs," Detective Morrison replied grimly. "Save your explanations for your lawyer." Duke had positioned himself between Jonathan and the women throughout the entire confrontation, but now he relaxed as the federal agents secured their prisoner. The dog's mission, which had begun months ago with Agent Mackenzie, was finally complete. As Jonathan was led away in restraints, Agent Santos turned her attention to the women who had survived his scheme. "We need to get all of you medical attention," she said, looking particularly concerned about Amanda's condition. "But first, I need to know if there are others. Are there more women hidden in the marsh?" Rebecca nodded weakly. "At least 2 more that we know of. Duke can show you where they are. He's been keeping track of everyone." Over the next several hours, the massive search and rescue operation uncovered the full extent of Jonathan's network. 5 more women were found in various hidden locations throughout the marsh, all in different stages of physical and psychological recovery. Each had a similar story: a romantic relationship with Jonathan, a dinner that ended in unconsciousness, and awakening in the wilderness with fragmented memories and no way home. But perhaps the most significant discovery came when Duke led the investigators to a sophisticated communication center hidden deep in the marsh. Here they found evidence of Jonathan's broader network, including contacts in other states who were running similar operations. Computer files revealed the scope of the Coastal Development Scheme, which would have displaced entire communities and destroyed thousands of acres of protected wetlands. "This goes far beyond simple inheritance fraud," Agent Santos explained to Margaret and Sophia as they waited for medical evacuation helicopters to arrive. Jonathan was the front man for a massive land grab that involved corrupt officials at multiple levels of government. Your daughter's survival and Duke's evidence gathering may have prevented one of the largest environmental disasters in Louisiana's history. The reunion between Sophia and her mother was emotional, but tempered by the understanding that their ordeal was far from over. There would be medical treatment, psychological counseling, legal proceedings, and the long process of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by Jonathan's manipulations. But there was also hope. As the rescued women were evacuated to hospitals in New Orleans, they carried with them not just trauma, but also the satisfaction of knowing that justice would finally be served. More importantly, they had each other, a network of survivors who understood exactly what they had endured. Duke remained close to Sophia throughout the evacuation process, as if reluctant to let her out of his sight after protecting her for so long. It was clear that the bond formed between them in the marsh had become something permanent and meaningful. "What happens to him now?" Sophia asked Agent Santos, gesturing toward Duke. "Officially, he's still federal property, Agent He," Santos replied with a smile. "But I think we can arrange for him to be assigned to a new handler, someone who understands his capabilities and appreciates his service." As the helicopter carrying Sophia, Margaret, and Duke lifted off from the marsh, Sophia looked down at the vast wetlands that had been both her prison and her salvation. The Louisiana Bayou stretched endlessly in all directions, a place of danger and beauty, of hidden secrets and unexpected allies. She thought about Agent Mackenzie, the woman she had never met, but who had saved her life through careful planning. And the training of a remarkable dog. Mackenzie's sacrifice had not been in vain. Her work had finally brought justice to the victims of Jonathan's scheme and prevented countless others from suffering the same fate. The helicopter turned toward New Orleans, carrying its passengers toward medical care, legal proceedings, and the beginning of healing. But for Sophia, the most important cargo was the knowledge that she had not only survived, but had helped to ensure that Jonathan Westfield would never hurt anyone again. As the familiar skyline of the city came into view, Sophia felt Duke's warm weight against her side and her mother's hand in hers. The nightmare was over, but the real work of rebuilding and recovery was just beginning. And for the first time since awakening in the marsh days ago, Sophia felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in New Orleans was packed with spectators as Jonathan Westfield's trial reached its dramatic conclusion. Sophia sat in the front row, her hand resting gently on Duke's head, watching as the man who had nearly destroyed her life faced the consequences of his actions. The evidence against him was overwhelming, thanks in large part to the recordings Duke had gathered and the testimony of 7 courageous women who had survived his scheme. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Catherine Landry, presented the final arguments with the precision of someone who had spent months building an ironclad case. Jonathan Westfield didn't just commit fraud, she told the jury. He attempted to erase the very existence of these women, to steal not just their property, but their identities, their futures, and their families' peace of mind. The evidence shows a pattern of calculated cruelty that spans multiple states and victimized dozens of families. As the judge read the verdict guilty on all counts, Jonathan's face remained impassive, but Sophia could see the defeat in his eyes. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, now looked like what he had always been, a predator who had finally been caught. The sentencing came a week later, 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, plus restitution to his victims and the forfeiture of all assets connected to his schemes. But for Sophia and the other survivors, the real victory wasn't the prison sentence. It was the knowledge that Jonathan could never hurt anyone else. Satoshi. Aftermath of the trial brought unexpected opportunities for positive change. The properties that Jonathan had illegally claimed were returned to their rightful owners, but many of the women chose to work together rather than simply reclaiming their individual inheritances. What emerged was a collaborative conservation project that would have made Agent Mackenzie proud. Sophia found herself at the center of this effort, using her environmental science background to coordinate what became known as the Gulf Coast Heritage Preserve. The combined properties created a massive protected area that included pristine wetlands, historic sites, and crucial wildlife habitat. Instead of being developed for Jonathan's profit, the land would be preserved for future generations. "It's what our families always intended," Rebecca explained during one of their planning meetings. "These properties weren't just investments, they were legacies. Now we can make sure they serve that purpose." Margaret had been instrumental in the legal aspects of the preserve, working pro bono to ensure that the conservation easements were properly structured and legally sound. The experience had brought mother and daughter closer together, creating a partnership that extended far beyond their family relationship. Duke had officially been retired from federal service and adopted by Sophia, though his investigative instincts remained sharp. He had become something of a celebrity in New Orleans, known as the Dog, who had helped solve one of the most complex fraud cases in Louisiana's history. But to Sophia, he was simply her partner and friend. the companion who had saved her life and helped her find her strength. The psychological recovery had been challenging for all of the survivors. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a trauma specialist who had worked with the women individually and as a group, helped them process not just the immediate trauma of their experiences, but also the deeper impact of having their trust and autonomy violated. What Jonathan did to you was designed to make you feel powerless, Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of their group sessions, but your survival and your choice to seek justice has returned that power to you. You are no longer victims, you are survivors and advocates. This perspective proved crucial as the women began speaking publicly about their experiences. Their story became a powerful tool for educating others about sophisticated fraud schemes and the importance of supporting survivors of manipulation and abuse. Sophia found herself frequently invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing her story not as a tale of victimization, but as one of resilience and justice. The coastal development project that had motivated Jonathan's scheme was permanently blocked by federal environmental protection orders, a victory that resonated throughout Louisiana's conservation community. The preserved wetlands would continue to serve as crucial protection against hurricanes and flooding, while also providing habitat for countless species of wildlife. But perhaps the most meaningful change came in Sophia's relationship with her family's land. What had once been simply an inherited property became a living memorial to the women who had been targeted by Jonathan's scheme. A portion of the preserve was designated as the Sarah Mackenzie Memorial Research Station, honoring the federal agent whose work had ultimately led to their rescue. Duke seemed to understand the significance of the memorial dedication ceremony. As Sophia spoke about Agent Mackenzie's sacrifice and the importance of the conservation work they were undertaking, the German Shepherd sat at attention, as if standing guard over the memory of his original handler. Agent Mackenzie believed that justice required not just punishment for wrongdoing, but also action to prevent future harm, Sophia told the gathered crowd. This preserve represents both aspects of that belief. It protects a precious natural resource, while also serving as a reminder that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice. The ceremony was attended by representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies, environmental groups, and academic institutions. But the most important attendees were the families of the women who had been victimized by Jonathan's scheme. Parents who had feared they would never see their daughters again now watched as those same daughters stood strong and united in their commitment to making something positive from their traumatic experience. As the sun set over the preserved wetlands that evening, casting golden light across the water where Sophia had once thought she might be lost forever, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The terror and confusion of awakening in the marsh seemed like a lifetime ago, though the memories remained vivid. Duke nudged her hand with his nose, drawing her attention back to the present moment. Around them, the bayou was alive with the sounds of evening, birds calling to their mates, frogs beginning their nightly chorus, and the gentle lap of water against the shore. It was peaceful now, a place of beauty rather than fear. "We did it, didn't we, boy?" she said to Duke, scratching behind his ears. "We made sure Agent Mackenzie's work wasn't in vain." Duke's tail wagged once, and Sophia could have sworn she saw satisfaction in his intelligent brown eyes. Together, they had faced down a powerful enemy and emerged victorious. More importantly, they had created something lasting and valuable from their experience. As they walked back toward the research station where Sophia now lived and worked, she thought about the future. There would be more conservation work, more speaking engagements, more opportunities to help other survivors of similar schemes. The Gulf Coast Heritage Preserve was just the beginning of what she hoped would be a lifetime commitment to protecting both the environment and the vulnerable people who depended on it. The story of Sophia Bennett and Duke the German Shepherd had captured the imagination of people across the country, but for Sophia, it wasn't really a story about herself. It was a story about the power of determination, the importance of never giving up on missing loved ones, and the unexpected allies who can emerge in our darkest moments. Most of all, it was a story about the truth that Agent Mackenzie had believed in so deeply that justice, though sometimes delayed, will ultimately prevail when good people refuse to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. Dear listeners, we hope that Sophia and Duke's incredible journey has moved and inspired you. This tale of courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and her canine protector reminds us that even in our darkest moments, hope and justice can prevail. If this story touched your heart, we have prepared a special playlist filled with equally captivating stories of survival, love, and triumph over adversity. You can find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed following Sophia's remarkable transformation from victim to advocate, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human resilience and the power of the human spirit. Don't miss our upcoming content, where we continue to share tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We'd love to hear your thoughts about Sophia and Duke's story in the comments below. Which moment moved you the most? Have you ever experienced an unexpected friendship that changed your life? Share your own stories of courage and hope with our community.